Well, friends, the Supreme Court of the United States just ruled to allow the EPA to impose even more onerous diktats on coal and natural gas power plants. It's just a snapshot of a longer motion picture, a film of depravity, destruction, and deviation from the U.S. Constitution. So let's dig in. From the very foundation of it, the unconstitutional, arrogant idea that there must be a centralized energy policy dictated on us from D.C., to Barack Obama pushing his 2008 threat that no one would be able to open a new coal electricity provision plant because his Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA regulations, yes, that's a euphemism for fascist commands, would make such openings impossible.
Under my plan of a cap and trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. Even, regardless of what I say about whether coal is good or bad, because I'm capping greenhouse gases, coal-powered plants, natural gas, you name it, whatever the plants were, whatever the industry was, they would have to retrofit their operations. That will cost money. They will pass that money on to consumers.
To the subsequent throttling of the coal industry in places like Pennsylvania and West Virginia, to the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline, to the Biden administration subsidizing electric vehicles and pushing to virtually eliminate legal sales of the internal combustion car by 2035, to international central bank and state political moves to establish a fraudulent cost of carbon and pretend there's a market for so-called carbon credits. The policies and provisions have been poisoned, predicated on an unsubstantiated climate change apocalypse canard that its promoters claim is coming, and about which they accuse skeptics of being essentially religious apostates. And now, one of the few speed bumps Americans might hope to slow down this steamroller, even momentarily, well, it's let us down. The Supreme Court of the United States on Wednesday voted 7-1 not to grant the request by 8 groups of state and business-based plaintiffs to block the EPA from enforcing onerous new emissions commands on coal and natural gas-based power plants, while the plaintiffs' original challenge continues to move through lower federal courts. As Caitlin Lewis reports for Newsweek, quote, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to put a hold on the Environmental Protection Agency's, EPA, new rule regarding greenhouse gas emission standards for power plants as some states challenged the law's legality. Conservative Justice Clarence Thomas broke with the rest of the court in the decision on Wednesday, according to the court's opinion. Justices ruled in a 7-1 vote that it was not necessary to grant an emergency stay request from West Virginia, Indiana, and dozens of other states and industry groups to halt the EPA rule while litigation on the issue continues in lower court. End quote. Curiously, Justice Samuel Alito didn't take part in the decision. Writes Lewis, quote, the EPA rule, which the Biden administration passed in April, requires that new and existing coal and natural gas power plants cut or capture 90% of their climate pollution by 2032. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who wrote the court's opinion, said that since the applicants need not start compliance work related to the EPA standards until next summer, they're unlikely to suffer irreparable harm before the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit decides the merits, end quote. For those who stand for a strict reading of the Constitution, who recognize the unconstitutional nature of the Nixon-created EPA and how it warps and usurps the idea of private property rights and traditional tort law, The majority decision to stay out of the case because the EPA isn't going to trigger compliance work until next summer, well, that should seem pretty irrelevant to people who care about the Constitution. It's the usurpation of property rights, the added attack on the Constitution, and the very conceit that the feds can dictate new so-called carbon capture technology that already stand as unacceptable. And journalist Lewis's parroting of the unsupported term climate pollution just adds to the problem. It's a problem fueled, I know you heard the pun, by both that kind of intellectual falsity and the immoral, unconstitutional mandates imposed by the EPA on states and private businesses. Quote, West Virginia Attorney General Patrick Morrisey said in a statement that those challenging the EPA rule will continue to fight through the merits phase and prove this rule strips the states of important discretion while forcing plants to use technologies that don't work in the real world. End quote. But surely the EPA knows best. And there's no long-term top-down international strategy to strangle so-called fossil fuel energy that for nearly 200 years has provided cheap power to generations and contributed to incredible progress for human living standards and prosperity. Surely the EPA is helping us, right? Quote, here the EPA again is trying to transform the nation's entire grid, forcing power plants to shutter, Morrisey added. End quote. Well said. As Lewis notes, quote, the states and industry partners who are seeking to block the EPA rule have argued that the agency has not proved that the regulations would curtail emissions to the degree the federal government claims. End quote. But the proof or lack of proof for the mandate curtailing emissions, as they say, curtailing emissions to the degree the federal government claims, isn't really the heart of the problem. At the heart of the problem is the unproven claim that the so-called emissions are pushing a climate apocalypse, plus the existence of the EPA itself, and how the EPA undercuts what in human history used to be necessary to block or punish human activity. That would be proof that the activity is damaging a person or his property. Thanks to Richard Nixon's monstrous creation, thousands of Americans have been prevented from peacefully using their private property. Trillions of dollars in market opportunities have been crushed, and countless lives have been harmed. And thanks to the EPA and the anti-market mentality behind the EPA, few students or pop media watchers are aware that the free market is the best driver of conservation. The market incentivizes conservation and penalizes waste. It incentivizes protection and long-term husbandry of resources and penalizes those who recklessly harm the property or lives of others. Instead, Nixon's creation slid in the falsehood that the centralized political machine can manage and control everything, prevent private action before any harm is proven, and force people to adopt expensive technology even when it will destroy their bottom lines. Oh, by the way, if that sounds more like a mafia than anything else, I think you might be on the right track. One reassuring point in this Supreme Court decision comes from Justice Kavanaugh. Quote, Kavanaugh said in the court's brief order on Wednesday that the applicants have shown a strong likelihood of success on the merits as to at least some of their challenges to the EPA's rule, end quote. But the question of the EPA itself is not part of the court's calculus. Some might claim that the EPA's so-called rules, what a wonderful euphemism for diktats, that these so-called rules are necessary because many of the energy plants are tied to state-created corporations or run by the states themselves. But the only provision in the U.S. Constitution that allows for addressing a conflict that might arise from state to state is the Interstate Commerce Clause, found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And it's supposed to be a remedial provision, an after-the-fact provision that allows states, capital S, as entities themselves to resolve trade disputes by turning to Congress. Under the EPA pre-crime regulatory schema, the EPA tells people how and with what they can conduct their energy provision business. That's not even close to what the founders envisioned. And it's about time that people, especially the Supreme Court justices, acknowledge this fact. Our future and the principles of freedom depend on it. Thanks for watching, everyone. Please like and subscribe. Of course, this case will be floating around in the lower courts for a while, but it's essential to get the information out, in my opinion. Find us on Rumble, where they don't censor us. Please follow us there. Share the videos far and wide. Of course, you can still find us on YouTube, where, yes, their censorious tendencies continue. And you can always find us at MRCTV.org. That's MRCTV.org, where you'll see what the whole team is doing. Please check us out there. Please consider donating to the Media Research Center, and of course check out the MRC-TV store. You can find us in Facebook, on TikTok, on Instagram, on X, and if you want to contact me on Gab, it's at Gardner Goldsmith, and on Twitter/X, I'm at Gard Goldsmith. Thanks for watching, everyone. Please share the videos far and wide, especially to students who are interested in these types of issues. For MRC-TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.